I'm going to tell you some stories about underdogs. And some of these stories are difficult to hear, so bear with me. But I think they're worth telling. And I'm going to tell you about underdogs who are made, created by us. The place I want to begin tonight is to tell you that there are some underdogs in this world that are made by us. They're turned into objects by other people who somehow deem them to be less than, an other. I work at the Bellevue NYU program for survivors of torture. And at Bellevue, we see folks from all around the world. They come to New York, having fled war zones, detention centers, prisons, in all kinds of countries. Kosovo, Tibet, DRC, Colombia, Sierra Leone, former Soviet Union. It's amazing how long the list is actually of places where humans are cruel to each other and turn them into the other. When Rose first came to see me, she was 17 years old, and she had been a refugee in a country in Africa because when she was 9, her whole family was killed by a group of people. And she fled and ended up in my office 8 years later. She was, to me, like a beautiful black ghost. She would sort of hover above our meetings at first. She was a truly amazing person. Ivan came from the former Soviet Union, and he would sit in my therapy office, in my office, with his hands gripping the chair, so white-knuckled that sometimes I thought either he would break in half or the arm of the chair would pop off. He was incredibly taut and tense as he tried to describe being dragged into a police station, held for 4 days, tortured and abused, and subjected to a mock execution. Dora was from the former Yugoslavia. When Dora tried to talk about being raped by paramilitary forces, she would hold a tissue in her hand and wring it and knead it like a piece of clay until it was sort of linty and like a pile of dust in her lap. All of these people taught me a great deal about how underdogs are made. But also they've taught me a tremendous amount more about how we undo and unmake the underdog. So first, we have to think about the dark part of the story, I guess, right? Which is that for some reason, humans have this tremendously terrible capacity to create lost causes and to deem others as not worth it, whatever it is, not worth rights, not worth education, not worth human dignity. And once we've done that, unfortunately, anything goes, it seems. Now, when a person has survived a natural trauma, a tsunami, a hurricane, an earthquake, something like that, they have a lot to contend with. But I would argue that man-made trauma creates its own set of difficulties as the person has to grapple with the fact that this horrible thing that I lived through, this terrifying thing, was done to me by someone else who chose to do it to me on purpose. So man-made trauma leaves its own set of difficulties in the survivor. For one thing, the survivor has to contend with the notion that someone decided, I can act upon you. I can turn you into an object under my control. One of the things about survivors is that they've experienced a moment where what I would call our mutual human agreement has been severed. And that agreement is what? Well, I would say we mostly agree as we walk around in civil society that we all have a right to our bodily integrity, our spiritual integrity, and our freedom. And torture and man-made violence severs that agreement. It ruptures it, and it breaks it. And once you have severed that, it is true, as I said, anything goes. And we've seen that all around the world. How else do you explain that as Ivan was dragged out of a filthy cell for yet another day of endless, answerless questions being posed to him for his interrogation, that his captors held him up, put a gun to his head, put it up, pulled the trigger to this deafening, mind-boggling click, and then threw him on the ground where he laid there terrified and crumbling? How else do you explain how Dora was dragged from her home in front of her family, put in a truck with other girls, and taken to an abandoned building where military personnel raped her repeatedly and laughed while she and the other girls cried out. How do you explain Rose? How do you explain how men entered her village and killed her entire family, 6 children and her parents, until in an amazing last moment of maternal fierceness, her mother hid her, Rose, under her body and saved her, protected her from these men? What I came to tell her was basically a life-saving reverse birth. How else do we explain it except that people have somehow decided anything goes? You're not a human anymore. So let's go to the good part of the story. How do we undo what has been done when someone has been turned into an object? Well, there's a saying that if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I sort of have to say I'm guilty of that because my hammer is my small therapy office and my ears and my mouth where I can listen and talk. And that's what I usually bring to a situation in which someone has been turned into an underdog and someone's been hurt. I say, let's talk about it. The place that therapy begins when you're trying to work with a survivor of unspeakable violence is with an invitation. I always invite my patients. It can be all different ways you do so, but you're inviting them and saying, let's sit together with this. Let's just sit together right now and see what happens. The second part of the invitation, though, is I ask permission. It's very important with a survivor of violence to ask their permission if you can act with them. So I'll ask permission to bear witness. Can I sit with you and hear it? Can I just be here for when you're ready to talk about it? I will always remember the moments when patients accept the invitation. I remember with Ivan that he was quite sure therapy was not for him, and he was certainly not going to return to those memories of what had been done to him, until I said, well, what was something you used to love to do? And he said, I used to paint. I loved painting. And I said, well, what if by sitting together and talking together, you might be able to paint again? And he became curious, and that's why he stayed. With Dora, I remember the invitation was simply a day where after weeks of her crying and saying, I don't know if I can do this, I made her laugh by telling her a story of something incredibly dopey I had done on the New York subway, where I had looked like a goofball. And she laughed so hard and so deeply, and I thought, I think she's taking the invitation. With Rose, the invitation was quite easy. She was 17. She was hungry for people and hungry to be having someone in her life who would share her launching into her life. So she was very eager to come in and tell me the first time she got a good grade on a test in the high school that we had helped her get into, when she got an admission letter to college in New York City. So when these patients took the invitation was the beginning of our process of undoing their state as underdogs. Let me tell you a little bit about trauma memories and how we address them. You have to understand, if you're going to work with people who've been traumatized, that their memory of what happened to them is not like a regular memory. That memory of a trauma was put into their brain, what we call encoded in their brain, during a time when their body was in high alert, fear, terror, disgust. All of these physiological reactions that they were having left a mark on the encoding, the imprinting of that memory. And what it did was it made it so when that memory returns, the memory holds that same fear in their body. It doesn't remind them or seem like it. It actually is the state of fear for a trauma survivor to remember. Remembering is the same as re-experiencing. Feeling it again, being hit, being cut, being raped, being humiliated again. So what you have to remember about a trauma survivor is they're afraid of remembering, because they know that when I remember, it's going to hurt again. It's going to make me frightened again. It's going to make me feel horrible again. So you have to teach the trauma survivor to trust this part of their body, that we know the body does that, but now we have to help the body unlearn that. And so I use sometimes something called exposure therapy that was not created by me. It was created by leaders in our field, incredible people, Edna Foa, Barbara Rothbaum, Maggie Schauer, Frank Nooner, people who've devised this, studied it in empirical studies in which they've proven its effectiveness. It's an incredible therapy. So when I do exposure therapy, like many of us who are out there doing it, what you're trying to teach the patient is that basically, if they can be with you and gradually and repeatedly is important, face that memory, it's going to lose its fear activation properties. They're not going to feel afraid. But it takes time. And remember, what's the one thing they don't want to do? Remember. They don't want to remember because it's going to feel horrible. So you end up teaching them that as they tell it with you, because you're with them, right? They're going to tolerate the fear reaction, as are you. You're going to hold it, and it's going to decrease. So the final piece of that, though, that's really the magic and the beauty of working with people who've been hurt by other people, is that what you're also going to do is together you're going to correct the meanings that they might have about these things that happened. Because the terrible thing about trauma is that it leaves people often with meanings that are not true about themselves. I'm incompetent. I'm disgusting. I'm less than. I'm destroyed. And so you get the incredible privilege of hearing that story, sitting with them, and helping them correct those meanings that they are less than, that they're an underdog. So Ivan, in therapy, would come in once we agreed we would work together and have lots to talk about for 15 or 20 minutes, always had lots to ask me, talk about, what do you think Ivan wanted to do? Change the subject, right? He always wanted to distract. And I would say, geez, Ivan, I think we should do a little work. And we would start to move towards those stories of what happened in those 3 days that he was held in that cell. And he would hold that chair, and he would do everything in his power to not cry and not lose control, until finally he could tell that story for the first time of the gun being put to his head and knowing he was going to die and hearing that click and then falling on the ground, until he could tell that over and over. And he would no longer shake. He would no longer be weeping. He would simply be telling the story of someone who had been cruel to him. That, for Ivan, was releasing through that exposure. Rose's exposure was different. We did not return again and again to what had happened to her family when they were killed by those men in that horrible, horrible day when she was a little girl. Rose's exposure came as we remembered over and over again the loss of her family and their absence now in her life. In other words, our exposure was our exposure to Rose's current life without her family because they'd been taken from her. So each of those milestones, we would sit and celebrate, and we would stop and say, what would your family say? My gosh, what would your mother say? Her daughter going to college in New York City. Look at these grades. Her daughter going to a fun New York party and being with friends. What would your dad say? What would your big brother say? We would remember the family in their absence in each milestone. And that became her way of being exposed to her trauma and grieving it. For Dora, the exposure took the shape of returning to the story of being taken from her home, put in this building, and raped. And what the exposure involved for her was changing that meaning, though she didn't know it, and I didn't know it until we got into it. Her first telling of that story, she cried and really, really felt overwhelmed and said, I am destroyed. I am damaged. I turned into an animal. And she told it again, and I said, let's talk about it. Let's do it again. Tell the story again. You have to understand, exposure, you will repeat the story over and over. And she said, again, the second telling, I'm destroyed. I'm ruined. And by third, I think fourth telling, she stopped at that same point, and she said, they were so cruel. Who does this to another living human? Who would hurt a girl like this? They were so cruel. And for me, what I was watching happen was her meaning around being hurt had changed. She was no longer to blame. She was no longer damaged. She was the subject in that story, not the object. And those people had made a decision that lowered them. So why do I tell you all this? Am I just a therapist telling you about therapy? Well, no, because what I think is most important to take from this is that we all have this capacity. We all have this power. There's no underdog whose story is not worth being told. And there's no one of us who can't sit with someone, take permission, receive permission to hear their story. We all have that power. And so when people choose to remember terrible things in their life, terrible things they felt and went through, and ways they were hurt, they reclaim their story, and they now are the subject of it. When we choose to bear witness to stories, we give that story a new meaning. Rose and Dora both finished therapy, got married, have beautiful families, stay in touch with me and call me for milestones, tell me great things about their life, and they're both doing really well. On my last day of therapy with Ivan, he came in and was struggling at the door with a package, and I helped him in, and he took off a sheet, and he had painted me a beautiful still life of pomegranates. And there were these beautiful pomegranates and a dark curtain behind them, and the curtain was opened, and there was a shaft of light coming through it. And he pointed to the light and he said, "This is us, and that's the work we did together." Remember, every underdog has a story, and don't be afraid to listen to it. Thank you.